I'm reading a book by Civil War historian Charles Bracelin Flood, and it's on the years of Robert E. Lee's life after the Civil War, his final years. And in one chapter of the book, Flood offers this little story. Now, years after the war, Lee was visiting a Kentucky woman who took him to the remains of this grand old tree. Now, we don't have grand old trees in the West, but in the South, a grand old tree is a thing of beauty. Well, the remains of it were there, and she bitterly cried that this beautiful tree had been destroyed by the Federal artillery. Every branch had been knocked off of it during a battle. And all that was left was this gnarled stump that had been completely robbed of life. And then she looked at Lee, hoping for some word condemning the North, or at least sympathizing with her loss. And after a brief silence, Lee just said, "Cut it down. Cut it down and forget it, my dear madam, and it's better to forgive the injustices of the past than to allow them to remain. Let bitterness take root, and it'll poison the rest of your life." Now, in this season of Lent, one of the things that we're asked to do is to take a close look at our lives and see where bitterness and poison are taking root. And there are a few things that poison us as much as unforgiveness. We see that in this parable. This parable is one of the so-called hard sayings of Jesus. These are things that Jesus teaches that seem to go beyond our ability to do or to carry out or enact in our own lives. And forgiveness is a very hard thing to be certain. Peter has asked Jesus how many times a person should forgive. And he thinks that he's really going to an extreme. He thinks Jesus is going to be really impressed with his answer because he says, "Should I forgive somebody like as many as 7 times after they've wronged me?" Now, I got to admit, I think that sounds pretty generous myself. I think it'd be hard to forgive somebody 7 times for serious wrongs. But Jesus answers that a person should go way beyond that. That they should forgive 77 times, or Donna got both parts of the translation because sometimes it's 70 times 7 times. Either way, whether it's 490 or 77, Jesus has blown Peter's expected to be brilliant answer out of the water. For Jesus, forgiveness is something that should just about be limitless. Then Jesus reinforces his point by telling a story. Now you see, there was this servant who worked for a king. Now the servant was in hock to the king for an astounding sum of money, 10,000 talents. Now a talent of silver is a huge amount. It was the largest denomination of currency. It would amount to about 30 pounds of silver. It's a huge quantity. 1 talent was worth about 15 years' wages for the average person, and this servant, he owes 10,000 talents. In terms of today's money, 10,000 talents worth of silver would be millions and millions of dollars, maybe $250 million. I'm not sure Jesus is particularly concerned with the exact monetary amount. The point is, it's so huge, the servant probably couldn't even pay interest on it. He'd never be able to pay it off, even if he had 1,000 lifetimes to do so. And yet, the king, because of the sheer goodness of his heart, not because of anything the servant has earned or merited, but just because he's such a good person, decides to forgive the debt. There's a clean slate. The servant breathes a sigh of relief. Well, he almost breathes a sigh of relief. But something is weighing on his mind. You see, one of his co-workers owes him 100 denarii. Now, 1 denarii was about a day's wages, at least for a working person. So 100 denarii, it's not an insignificant amount of money. It might be like somebody owing you $8,000 or $10,000. It's not a small amount, it's significant. But compared to the huge sum of money the servant has just been forgiven, it's a pittance. And no sooner does he leave the king's chambers than he rushes to the servant's quarters, grabs the man by the throat, and demands to know where his money is. And when the servant can't pay, he has him locked up. Well, the king hears about this. He's been pretty generous, extremely generous to this servant. And he hears how the servant has treated someone who owed him a debt. He's furious. The unforgiving servant is handed over to be tortured. And then Jesus finishes his story and he turns solemnly to the disciples and he says, "This is what my heavenly Father will do to you if you don't forgive your brother and sister from the heart." What we see here is Jesus at his most serious. We like to think of Jesus as the one who comes to give grace and show us how much God loves us, and that's all true. But here we also see Jesus in a very serious moment giving us a very serious warning. God has gone to extraordinary lengths to forgive. He's come to bring good news. He gave everything of himself, all that he had. He canceled a huge debt of sin on our behalf. And the cost was expensive. Now, if God can do that for us, then we can let go of the deadness and misery of resentment. We can forgive too. If you don't forgive, then don't expect to be forgiven. It's as simple as that. We could finish the sermon right there. Now, don't get me wrong. It's no wonder this is a hard saying, because forgiveness is a hard thing. But Jesus is telling us to learn to forgive even on the big issues. There are no caveats. You know, it'd be easy to stand here and try to talk around this passage or interpret my way around it, to be able to say, well, the Bible says to forgive, but, you know, this kind of situation, it's just too much. You really shouldn't forgive that. Or, you know, this is a special case. But the truth is the Bible is clear as day. God has forgiven us of something big. We need to forgive as well. So what makes forgiveness so hard? It's hard to forgive because it means letting go of something that we feel entitled to. And let's face it, I mean, there are little things in life, people, sometimes we get wronged in little ways. Someone cuts in front of us in the grocery store, or we hear gossip, things like that. I mean, those are things where we just kind of need to get over it. But there are things in our lives that happen. Things that are hard to forgive, things that are big. To forgive somebody is to say, you've done something unspeakable. By all rights, I should call it quits between us. Both my pride and my principles demand no less. However, though we both may carry the scars for life, I refuse to let it stand between us. To accept forgiveness means to admit that you've done something unspeakable that needs to be forgiven. And that's the funny thing about forgiveness. Both parties must swallow the same thing, and that's their pride. So how do we get from there to here? How do we learn to forgive even the big things? Well, a start is to recognize that we shouldn't keep score in life. Unforgiveness begins with the assumption that life should be fair, that someone has wronged you and made your life unfair, and that you have the right to revenge or payment back, and you deserve some kind of restitution. But life isn't fair. You know what I like about Jesus' response to Peter's question? When he says that a person should forgive 77 times, it's not like he's saying that we should wait, and on that 78th time we should really let the person have it. Jesus isn't saying, who would live like that? Who would live keeping track of how many times a person has wronged them and by 75 or 76 times start getting really excited, finally you're going to get a chance for revenge? Who does that? Jesus is saying we should forgive and forgive and forgive. Forgiving means that we don't keep count. If we're keeping count, we're not forgiving. There's no point in burying the hatchet if you're going to remember where you buried it. Forgiveness is hard. But forgiveness, in the words of Reynold Neighbor, is the final form of love. So what about those big things? What about the things that people do that really hurt us to the core? How do we forgive something which seems unforgivable? Kouri ten Boom, the Holocaust survivor and Dutch Christian writer, wrote about a time when she felt wronged by someone else. She had forgiven this person, but she kept rehashing the incident. She was even losing sleep over it. She was still angry about it. And the Lord gave her comfort and peace through the words of a Lutheran pastor that she went to visit, who she came to with this dilemma. And he said, up there in the church is a bell. which is wrung by pulling on a rope. But you know what? After you let go of the rope, the bell, it keeps swinging for a while. And after you let go, it swings more slowly, but it still tolls for a little while. And slowly it slows down until finally there's no toll and it stops. I believe the same thing is true of forgiveness. When we forgive, what we are doing is taking our hand off the rope. But you know what? After you let go of the rope, the bell just keeps on swinging. And with each swing, it rings out. But it swings slower and slower. They're just the tolling of the old bell slowing down. Angry thoughts continue for a while, but they will stop with time. And that's just it. Forgiveness isn't an emotion, it's a decision. When we forgive, our anger subsides. It's not the other way around. We can't wait till we're not angry anymore and then forgive. If we wait until we're not angry, then we'll never forgive. The good news is we've been taught how to forgive. God forgave all of us for our many sins. By the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, our debt has been marked paid in full. But that is just the beginning. Jesus wanted his disciples to understand something. How could they live with Christ if they couldn't live with one another? I have a friend who pastors a church in Washington State, and she went to a luncheon for Prison Fellowship, which is the name might lead you to deduce, is a ministry for people who are in prison. And midway through this luncheon, through this meal, they were having the typical awkward, we've never met before kind of table conversation. And she was having this conversation with Ruth and John, two people sitting at her table. Well, midway through the meal, Ruth leaned over to my friend and said, the man I'm eating lunch with killed my brother. She told how John had murdered her brother during a robbery. He'd served 18 years in prison and then settled into life on a dairy farm. And that's where she met him 20 years after the crime. She was compelled by Christ's command to forgive. Ruth had gone to her enemy and offered forgiveness. Then she had taken him to her father's deathbed and prompted reconciliation. Now, this incredible act, it didn't lead John to Christ. He's not a Christian. By generic Christian standards, some might not see this as a success story. He didn't go to a monastery and live the rest of his life in prayer and contemplation. But think of the power of God's love in that relationship. John's better for it. John said to my friend, Christians are the only people I know that you can kill their brother and they'll make you a part of their family. John's life is better because of forgiveness. But what's amazing is that Ruth's life is better because of it too. She could have held on to the anger. She could have bottled it up. But it was better for her to forgive. That's a countercultural thing. Think about a lot of our cheesy action movies. Arnold Schwarzenegger, or more and more, hopefully, someone younger than Arnold Schwarzenegger, something happens to him in the movie and he's wronged. Someone kidnaps his family or her family or steals something precious. I always think of Liam Neeson in Taken or Denzel Washington in Man on Fire. Something's happened to them that's wrong. And what do in the movie? Well, they blow up the whole world in their quest for revenge. Now really, who lives like that? How would that work out in reality? People always carrying out vendettas against one another, destroying anything or anyone that stands in their way. If you want to see brave, if you want to see heroics, then look at someone who knows how to forgive. The brave ones are like Ruth in Washington State, who went out on a limb, who took a risk to forgive someone who'd hurt her. Her life is better for it. And that's what's really good about forgiveness. Forgiveness is good for us. Now, I'm not saying that it's easy. I'm not saying that the wounds that people have caused us aren't real or that they'll just disappear. Some wounds will be with us forever. But letting them fester in unforgiveness doesn't solve anything. I want to do a little exercise. Consider this. Take just a moment and ask yourself if you are being called to forgive someone. Is there someone who's done something really wrong to you Maybe it was in the distant past. Maybe it was recently. Think about that person and what makes you so angry at them. I'm not doubting the reality or the magnitude of the hurt. I bet many of you have big things that have happened. I bet there are people who deserve blame for those. Now stop and ask yourself, whoever hurt you, do you think they still remember what they've done to you? Do you think they're losing sleep over it? The thing that they've done, do you think they're racked with guilt by it? I'd suggest to you that the answer is no. People brood over how they've been wronged. People don't brood over how they've wronged others. It's in our nature to want to forget that. So with that in mind, let me further suggest to you that the only person holding on to the wrong is you. That's the really devastating part. Unforgiveness allows another person, I don't remember who said this, but I think it's clever. Unforgiveness allows another person to live rent-free in your own heart. When you forgive, when you let go, the person who benefits most is you. Forgiveness is the first step toward living in peace. It's the only way toward living in peace. I want to call DJ up real quick. Some of you may have noticed DJ was acting a little odd today. Come on up. You can come up. Bring your friends. He was acting a little odd today, and it wasn't just those awkward teenage years, although he is awkward, but that's okay. We love him. DJ's been carrying this rock around, this stone. How are you enjoying yourself with that stone so far, DJ? Not so much, right? We did this Wednesday night too, and then I told him he had to do it Sunday. What we talked about Wednesday night is that this stone is like unforgiveness. This is something that's happened, that DJ's been wrong somehow. He can carry it around as long as he wants. But the thing is it's heavy. It gets old. I was really hoping you'd do the offering today, so it'd be kind of awkward as you were passing the plates and everything, but that's okay. That's just it, is carrying around unforgiveness is awkward, and it is burdensome. It gets old after a while. What needs to happen is we need to let go of it because it's good for us not to have to carry this stupid thing around any longer. All right? What's happening in your life that you need to stop carrying around? Not for the person who put it in your hands, sorry about that, but because it's good for you. This is heavy, I'm going to put it down too. Thank you, DJ. When we forgive, it's best for us. It's best for the world. And it's the only thing, it's one of the greatest things that can move us deeper into our relationship with God and into living peace with one another. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.